The ribbon came loose with a lazy whisper, and every laugh in our living room seemed to pause the moment Hannah lifted the lid of the gift I had wrapped myself. The fireplace crackled cinnamon and coffee warmed the air, and her perfume too sweet for morning rose like a dare between us. She peeled back the tissue paper slow as if savoring attention, and then her smile faltered at the first glossy corner of a photograph peeking through. Nathan shifted in his armchair, the kind of move that looks casual to everyone except the woman who's cataloged every tell. Around us, family chatter thinned to a hush, like a theater dimming the lights, and I realized how quiet a room can get when the truth walks in, wearing a bow. Before I tell you the rest, tell me where you're listening from tonight, and if stories of quiet justice help you drift off or sit up straighter. Tap like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. My name is Isabella, and I turned 36 this fall. The kind of age where a woman knows the shape of her life and the seams that don't lie flat anymore. I grew up in a small New England town where my mother taught me that generosity is a discipline, not a performance, and that you don't put your name on kindness like it's a plaque. When she passed, the modest inheritance she left was meant to be a foundation tuition for Lily one day, a cushion for the storms we couldn't see yet. Security a woman shouldn't have to ask for. Nathan and I met young, both hungry, both certain the world was about to say yes. He was charming in a way that made people lean in, and I was the one who remembered details, names, and what needed fixing before a meeting started. We married under white lights in a rented garden and carried our boxes into a narrow Boston brownstone like pioneers staking a claim. Nathan called it our launch pad. I ran numbers, looked at interest rates, and let him believe vision and discipline were the same thing. I turned down a posting in New York because he swore Boston was where the doors would open for him, and I believed in timing, in seasons, in the promise that for now is not forever. We built a life that photographed well Lily's drawings taped to the fridge. Sunday pancakes, the occasional dinner at a restaurant with a host who knew our name. People who visited saw harmony, and often so did I, because if you're always on time with the little things, it's easy to convince yourself the big things are fine. There were differences between us you could measure and ones you couldn't. I knew every bill date and saved receipts in tidy folders. He knew exactly where to stand in a room to be handed another drink. I came from women who clipped coupons and kept promises. He came from men who made introductions and told stories about futures they could almost touch. We made it work the way many couples do. He pushed forward, I held steady, and we called the friction ambition. When Lily was born, the house learned a new sound, soft breathing in the midnight hours, and the sacrifice felt like purpose. I told myself that putting my career in second place for a while was a trade, not a loss, and I made peace with the quiet pride of making everything run on time. But harmony has a weight limit, and sometimes it's the smallest shift that tells you the cables are strained. It wasn't a fight or a dramatic scene, at least not at first. It was a whiff of unfamiliar fragrance lingering on a shirt that wasn't supposed to be worn to client dinners, and a laugh that arrived too late when I asked who he'd been with. It was the way his phone learned to sit face down like etiquette for secrets, and the way his eyes slid past mine when I asked the kinds of questions that should have had easy answers. I told myself stress makes people strange, that pressure twists tone, that we were just tired, because love will hand you softer explanations until you're brave enough to refuse them. By December, our tree was up, and the brownstones smelled like pine and brown sugar, but the air had that thin crackle you hear just before a record skips. Nathan insisted we host, insisted we show the family how well things were going, insisted that success looks best when other people are there to witness it. I set the table, fluffed the couch pillows, and pressed a clean dress while an ache I couldn't name settled behind my ribs. He mentioned a coworker who might stop by with a gift. I said nothing and measured flour for cinnamon rolls because sometimes the right move is to let a story walk itself to the edge of the cliff. So when the doorbell rang and Hannah stepped in with glossy hair and a smile calibrated to land just shy of intimate, I was ready in a way that surprised even me. The room did what rooms do around charisma. It opened, and I watched him bask, and I watched her orbit, and I realized how steady my hands had become. I poured coffee past plates and tucked Lily's hair behind her ear, while the morning arranged itself into a scene I couldn't unsee. And as I reached beneath the tree for a small box, I had wrapped myself tied with a ribbon that would loosen with the gentlest pull. I felt the hush move through me like a tide turning. I placed the gift in Hannah's lap and smiled the way a hostess does when she hopes a guest enjoys the surprise, and for a heartbeat even I could almost believe I'd chosen peace. Then the paper tore, the lid lifted, and the first edge of what waited inside caught the firelight just enough to make her blink. She looked up at Nathan as if a cue had gone missing, and he laughed one beat too loud, one beat too late. Outside, the snow kept falling quiet and relentless, and inside, I understood that this was the last moment before the music changed. The paper had barely left Hannah's hands when my mind pulled me backward years before the tree and the firelight to a time when the warning signs were already flickering. We had met in our 20s, both determined to prove ourselves, both eager to build something bigger than our modest beginnings. He was magnetic in a way that turned heads at parties, and I was practical in a way that kept the bills paid and the future mapped out in neat columns. At first, it felt like a balance, his charm opening doors, my steadiness keeping them from slamming shut. I wanted to believe that was partnership, not foreshadowing. In those early days, I told myself small sacrifices were stepping stones. I gave up a posting in New York because Nathan insisted Boston was where the real chances waited for him. Just for now, he promised, squeezing my hand, swearing that once his career found its legs, we would circle back to mine. I wanted so badly to believe that love meant patience, that timing was everything, and that trust could fill in the gaps between my opportunities and his. When my mother passed, I inherited enough to give us security, the kind she had never known growing up. I thought I was placing it in safe hands when I agreed to let Nathan invest it wisely. That decision became the house, his car, and the seed money for ventures he controlled. While my name slowly disappeared from the story of how we got there. When Lily arrived, life was supposed to knit itself into something lasting. She was a soft miracle, tiny fists, clenching my finger eyes, searching for anchors. I poured myself into caring for her, believing Nathan's long nights at the office were proof of his commitment to providing for us. I stayed up reheating plates gone cold, folding laundry at midnight, and listening to his muffled voice on the phone in the next room. Each time I smelled liquor or perfume I hadn't poured or sprayed, I smoothed over the jagged edge with explanations, stress client dinners, the cost of ambition. I repeated what other women told me, that marriage was hard, that sometimes the reward came after long seasons of endurance. But deep down, the ground beneath me was already shifting. The cracks were small but steady. He angled his phone away when texts came in. He grew sharp when I asked about meetings that ended well past midnight. There was always another reason, another story polished just enough to pass. I told myself it was my fault for prying, that good wives didn't nag, that loyalty meant choosing silence when words could wound. I practiced smiling for photos, nodding at parties, and speaking with warmth that didn't match the weight in my chest. But you can't smile forever when you're starving for the truth. The moment denial broke wasn't about me at all. It was about Lily. She slipped into my bed one night while Nathan was working late again, her hair smelling faintly of crayons and soap, her voice no louder than a secret. "Mommy, why does Daddy hug that lady at his office?" My body went rigid, my arms pulling her close as if I could protect her from the knowledge already spilling out of her. "What lady, sweetheart?" I asked, praying she meant someone harmless. "The pretty one with shiny hair." He called her Hannah. My stomach turned heavy, my throat too tight for air. Children don't invent things like that. They see what's in front of them while adults scramble to invent softer versions. That night, I kissed her forehead, told her she was safe, and whispered that Mommy would handle it. Inside, though, something shattered clean through. From then on, every gesture toward Nathan was staged. I cooked his favorite meals and smiled at the right moments, but behind my eyes, I was cataloging every late arrival, every suspicious call, every trace of her in our lives. My marriage wasn't a partnership anymore. It was a performance. I was an actress on a stage I hadn't chosen, playing the role of a dutiful wife while preparing for the moment the mask would fall. I couldn't shield myself from betrayal, but I could shield Lily. She wouldn't grow up thinking deception was love. She wouldn't learn humiliation as her inheritance. Christmas morning didn't appear out of nowhere. It was the culmination of months of quiet endurance, of holding my tongue until I knew how to strike. By the time Nathan insisted Hannah should drop by with a gift, I wasn't surprised. The way her eyes clung to him across the living room wasn't new. It was only bolder. Family sat shoulder to shoulder chatter, covering tension like a flimsy tablecloth. But I felt the air thickening, waiting for the truth to press its way out. My sister Sophie glanced at me more than once, questions in her eyes I wasn't ready to answer. I wrapped gifts with ribbons tight enough to keep a secret safe, and one small box with something different inside. Looking back, the signs had never been subtle. They were loud, glaring, impossible to miss if I had allowed myself to name them sooner. But love is skilled at dimming the light, until neon looks like candle glow. I told myself lies because the truth would have torn everything down and I wasn't ready for rubble. That morning, though, rubble was exactly what I chose. As Hannah peeled the paper away and found not perfume, not jewelry, but evidence of every secret meeting and stolen hour, the hush in the room confirmed what I had known for months. The facade was over. My daughter's wide eyes, my sister's sharp intake of breath, even Richard's booming demand for answers, those were the sounds of denial dying in real time. And as I stood there, calm in the storm, I realized the first crack in my marriage had always been there. It only took Lily's quiet courage to show me the fracture line. That line had widened into a canyon, and on Christmas morning, I was done trying to build bridges across it. The rest of my plan was already waiting, but the night wasn't finished, teaching me how fragile appearances can be. Part of me still thought Nathan would chase me into the cold, would fight to salvage dignity in front of family. Instead, he froze, sputtering excuses as Hannah scrambled, and I walked out into falling snow, with Lily's voice echoing in my mind. The gift had been unwrapped, but the true reckoning hadn't yet begun. That would come in the days that followed, when silence turned into strategy and heartbreak hardened into action. The morning after Christmas, the brownstone felt hollow, stripped of the warmth it had pretended to hold. Wrapping paper still lay scattered across the floor. The tree leaned to one side, and silence pressed in from every wall. Nathan hadn't come home after the chaos, and I didn't expect him to. I sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee, the laptop glowing in front of me. There were no tears left. Whatever grief I had carried into Christmas had already burned away. All that remained was cold, steady resolve. I had prepared for this moment long before Hannah opened that box. Quiet research in the middle of sleepless nights had led me to an attorney whose reputation for precision was unmatched. Her number lived in my phone, waiting for the day I finally gathered the courage to call. That morning, I dialed without hesitation. She answered on the second ring, her tone alert as if she had been expecting me. "It's time," I told her, and she knew exactly what I meant. By noon, the first set of emergency filings were in motion. The practical steps came quickly. I logged into the bank accounts Nathan believed he controlled and began moving every dollar I could into an account he didn't know existed. Each transfer felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, undoing years of blind trust that had chained me to his ambitions. The numbers shifted from one screen to another, and with each click, I breathed easier. By the time I closed the laptop, his access was frozen. For the first time in years, the money my mother had left me was beyond his reach. Next came the physical work. I pulled boxes from the basement and began packing what mattered: Lily's clothes, her favorite books, the framed photo of my mother that had always sat on the mantel. I wasn't interested in fighting over furniture or dishes. Let him drown in the things he thought made him important. I cared only for what held memory and meaning. As I taped the first box shut, I heard Lily's small voice behind me. She stood in the doorway, hair tangled from sleep, clutching the hem of her pajamas. "Mom, what are you doing?" she asked softly. I crouched to her level, cupping her cheeks in my hands. "We're going to stay with Aunt Sophie for a while, sweetheart. Just you and me." Her eyes widened. "What about Daddy?" I kissed her forehead, steadying my voice. "Daddy has some things he needs to figure out. But you and we're going to be just fine." She nodded, trusting me completely. And that trust gave me strength I didn't know I still had. By late afternoon, the house looked less like a home and more like a stage after the show had ended. Boxes lined the hallway, ready to be carried out. That was when the door opened and Nathan finally stumbled inside. His eyes were bloodshot, his suit wrinkled, and the smell of whiskey clung to him like a second skin. He froze when he saw the stacks of boxes. "What the hell is this?" he barked, his voice jagged with disbelief. I didn't flinch. "It's called consequences," I said evenly. His laugh came bitter and broken. "You think you can just walk away? This house, these accounts, everything we built, it's mine too." I stood tall, my voice steady. "Correction. It was mine first. I built you, Nathan. My inheritance bought this roof, my sacrifice fueled your career, and my hands raised our daughter while you played house with your mistress. And now I'm taking it back." He slammed his fist on the counter, rattling the coffee mugs. "You can't do this. You can't just erase me." I walked past him, calm, deliberate. "Watch me." He lunged for his phone, swiping furiously as he tried to log into our accounts. I watched his face go pale as error messages flashed back at him one after another. "What did you do?" His voice cracked a tone I had never heard from him before. I turned at the doorway, coat already in my hand. "I took back what's mine. You thought I'd fall apart, cry in a corner while you played family with her. But I'm not the woman you married anymore." At that moment, Lily appeared beside me with her backpack slung over one shoulder. I reached for her hand. Nathan's jaw tightened as his eyes flicked between us. "You're poisoning her against me." I shook my head. "You did that all by yourself." With that, I opened the door and stepped into the cold December air. The wind cut sharp against my skin, but it felt like freedom. Lily and I walked down the steps together, leaving Nathan standing in the ruins of his control. He shouted my name, desperate, but I didn't turn back. Not once. The decision was already made, and there was no undoing it. From that moment forward, I wasn't a victim anymore. I was the architect of his unraveling, and this was only the beginning. The days that followed moved quickly. By morning, word had spread among the circles Nathan had once ruled so confidently. Mrs. Clean, a family acquaintance, mentioned seeing him at the country club when his card was declined at lunch. She described the way he flushed red as the cashier asked for another form of payment, how whispers followed him out the door. Embarrassment traveled fast in Boston, and for a man who lived on reputation, it was a wound that bled deeper than money. At first, he tried to push back. He called the bank, cursed at customer service, demanded explanations, But the holds were in place, the accounts locked, and the trail I had left was precise enough that even his lawyer couldn't untangle it without exposing his finances to scrutiny. While he scrambled, Hannah felt the first sting of exposure herself. A set of photographs and receipts made their way into the right hands, and by Monday her desk at work was cleared. She left the office with a cardboard box, while her coworkers stared at the floor, unwilling to meet her eyes. By the end of that week, Nathan's allies were retreating. Acquaintances who once welcomed him to dinner suddenly stopped returning his calls. Even his younger brother, who had once co-signed loans to help cover embarrassing debts, sent him a carefully worded email filled with phrases like, "Protect the brand," and "minimize damage." It was the kind of language that meant one thing: distance. The family name mattered more than loyalty to a disgraced son. For me, the changes were quieter, but sharper. Parents at Lily's school, who used to invite us to playdates, began asking for reassignment. Invitations that once came weekly no longer appeared. Our world contracted in ways that could have felt lonely, but instead, they reminded me that isolation is better than false company. I chose silence over lies, and in that silence, I found clarity. At night, I would tuck Lily into bed, her small arms wrapping around me, her voice whispering, "Are we safe now, Mommy?" I brushed her hair back and kissed her forehead, promising her we were. The truth was finally out, and once exposed, there was no hiding. Nathan's empire had been built on my inheritance and my trust, and now both were beyond his reach. He thought betrayal would leave me broken, but he underestimated the strength of a woman who has nothing left to lose. Part 3 of my story was not about rage. It was about control, about finding steady ground in the middle of chaos, and choosing piece by piece to dismantle the life Nathan had built on lies. The breaking point was still ahead, but by then, I knew I was ready. And as I lay awake some nights, listening to the quiet hum of the city through Sophie's guest room window, I realized the most dangerous part of revenge wasn't the anger. It was the patience. When I look back on those first weeks after Christmas, I realized that the hardest part wasn't anger. It was the silence that followed after the storm. Nathan tried to reach me, calls that went unanswered, messages that shifted from defiance to pleading, but I had already stepped into a different season of my life. My lawyer guided me through each step paperwork, stacking in neat piles that told the truth of where our money had gone and how it had been used. Every page I signed felt like a brick removed from the wall Nathan thought would keep me bound to him forever. For the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of what came next. Nathan, on the other hand, couldn't help himself. His first attempt at saving face came through a staged photograph. It was Lily who showed me holding my phone out with confusion. Nathan had posted a smiling picture of the two of them at an ice cream shop captioned with words that painted him as the devoted father standing strong against lies. The comments poured in, some sympathetic but most sharp and merciless. Old receipts I had quietly passed into the right hands resurfaced beneath his posts, time-stamped hotel bills and photos no one could ignore. The internet didn't care about his narrative. They cared about the truth, and the truth was already in circulation. When he realized the photo hadn't saved him, Nathan tried again with words. He sat down for a local television interview, wearing the last expensive suit that hadn't been pawned or repossessed, leaning forward as if sincerity could be rehearsed. His voice trembled in just the right places as he spoke about family and forgiveness, about being a man who had made mistakes but never stopped being a provider. For a moment, even I felt that old reflex tug at me, the one that used to smooth over every lie he told. But then, the counterweight arrived. Emails and text messages leaked into public forums side by side with his carefully chosen words. Business trips that were really hotel escapes, company dinners that were personal indulgences. His sincerity collapsed under the weight of his own handwriting. Hannah's downfall came quickly after. She deleted her accounts, scrubbed photos, and retreated from public view, but the damage was already done. A video of her storming out of her office carrying an HR box surfaced, and strangers added captions sharp enough to cut. She had once walked into my living room with a silk blouse and too much perfume, but now she couldn't walk into her own workplace without whispers. By spring, she had vanished from Boston altogether, leaving no trace except for the wreckage she helped create. I didn't need to fight loudly. All I did was remain steady while the truth unraveled Nathan's every attempt to hold control. When the clip of my confrontation at Delaney's restaurant surfaced online, I understood how quickly reputation shifts in a city like ours. Diners had recorded it, whispers spreading before the video even finished uploading. The line I had chosen, that you can't build a kingdom on stolen bricks, spread far beyond the walls of that restaurant. People repeated it in offices and living rooms, in comments beneath news articles. Nathan wasn't just a man caught in an affair. He was a punchline. But humiliation was only one layer of the consequence. The legal process was waiting like a patient fire, burning slow and steady. My lawyer had already prepared the filings, and I came armed with every document she needed: inheritance records, account statements, receipts that mapped every misused dollar. Nathan strutted into court trying to paint me as unstable, but the evidence was too heavy for spin. The judge asked for disclosures, and each file showed how my inheritance had been siphoned into his ventures. His face drained of color as truth replaced performance. Without my support, his empire had never existed. Custody was its own battlefield. Nathan tried to argue that he had been a devoted father, that the photo with Lily proved his role. But the records told another story. School events he missed nights away on supposed business trips, hours billed to clients that were spent elsewhere. Lily's gentle testimony, guided with care, carried more weight than anything else. She spoke softly about waiting for him, about seeing him embrace Hannah in plain sight at his office. She wasn't angry. She was honest, and her honesty pierced through every excuse. The ruling was swift: full custody to me, supervised visits for him. That moment was not victory. It was protection. Even as I walked out of the courtroom, I reminded myself that the legal dismantling was only beginning. The house Nathan had called his symbol of success went on the market. I reminded the court, whose money had paid the down payment, whose sacrifice had bought stability. The proceeds were wired directly into my account, shielded by law beyond his reach. His precious car, polished more faithfully than our marriage had ever been, was hauled away by a tow truck while neighbors watched. Someone filmed it, and the video circled through our community with captions mocking the fall of a man who once bragged about his status. At work, his colleagues distanced themselves one by one. Investigations into misused company funds grew louder, board members slipping into quiet meetings without him. Contracts froze, investors pulled out, and the once glossy facade of Nathan as a rising executive dissolved into debt and disgrace. Even his own father delivered the harshest cut. Richard Lancaster had tolerated arrogance for years, but public shame was unforgivable. He summoned Nathan to the family estate, and with words that spread quickly through whispered channels told him he was no longer his son. The Lancaster name would not carry his stain. I didn't need to witness the exact moment those words were spoken. It was enough to know that Nathan had finally been confronted by the man whose approval he had chased all his life. Even stripped of money and influence, he still had his pride, and now even that had been severed. By spring, Hannah was gone, Richard had turned his back, and Nathan was left clinging to fragments of a life he couldn't rebuild. For me, life was shifting towards something steadier. Lily and I moved into a small apartment filled with light. It wasn't a brownstone or a mansion, but it was ours, free of ghosts and free of pretense. She decorated her room with fairy lights and posters, her laughter filling the walls in a way that reminded me what peace felt like. I poured myself into work, my clients recognizing the composure I had held through public scandal. They trusted me with their own crises, and my small PR practice began to flourish. What once felt like survival was becoming something stronger. At night, I would watch Lily at the kitchen table, bent over her homework, her voice humming as she worked. "Mommy? I'm glad it's just us," she said one evening without looking up. "You're happier now." I smiled, brushing her hair back when she leaned against me. She had seen more than she should have, but she hadn't learned despair. She had learned resilience. That was the inheritance I wanted her to carry. Still, I knew Nathan wouldn't go quietly. Humiliation cut him deeper than loss ever could, and his attempts to reclaim dignity were not finished. The battles to come would test my patience and sharpen my resolve. The breaking point, the moment I would stand before him with no hesitation, was still ahead. And as I lay awake some nights, listening to the steady rhythm of Lily's breathing from the next room, I understood something simple. Strength wasn't about shouting louder. It was about holding steady until the storm exhausted itself. The storm around Nathan was far from over, and I was ready for what came next. Humiliation was never going to be enough for Nathan. He could endure whispers and even the sting of lost income, but his pride was built on being seen, admired, envied. Once the city began laughing instead of listening, he became reckless. His first move was to exploit Lily. He posted photographs of the two of them together, ice cream cones in their hands, the caption beneath painting him as a wounded father, holding strong against a cruel ex-wife. The comments at first leaned his way, strangers urging him to stay strong for the kids. But the tide shifted as quickly as it began. Receipts I had already released found their way under his post time-stamped hotel stays that overlapped with the very days he claimed to be at home. His version of fatherhood unraveled in the comment section, and the photo became a monument to his dishonesty rather than his devotion. When that failed, Nathan doubled down. He sat across from a local anchor in a carefully pressed suit, trying to wear sincerity like a second skin. His voice softened in all the right places, his eyes glistened as he spoke about love and forgiveness. Mistakes were made, he said, as though infidelity, fraud, and neglect could be condensed into a single misstep. For a brief moment, I felt the old pull, the one that once had me believing he could turn anything into a story worth forgiving. But I didn't flinch this time. Within hours of the broadcast, emails and text messages surfaced online, pairing his performance with undeniable proof of deceit. Expense reports marked as business trips were lined up against his words, making him look like a man auditioning for sympathy rather than telling the truth. The unraveling grew louder each day. Hannah, stripped of her job and reputation, tried to vanish, deleting accounts and pulling away from the circles that once fed her pride. Yet the internet is not so easily erased. A video appeared of her carrying a cardboard box out of her office while colleagues looked away. The caption mocked the promotion she had once bragged about, and the clip traveled farther than she ever had in her career. By then, she was already gone from the city, leaving Nathan to stand alone in a fire he had started. I did not fan the flames, not publicly. I posted only once a picture of Lily and me baking cookies in our small kitchen flour on our cheeks, the caption reading, "Building memories, not kingdoms." That quiet post was enough. The comments poured in with words of support, drawing the contrast I wanted, his desperation against my steady calm. I didn't need to argue with him online. I simply had to let the truth do the work. Still, Nathan could not resist. Each attempt he made to repair his reputation only added weight to his collapse. His name began trending on business networks not for his deals, but for his downfall. Articles dissected how not to manage personal image, using him as a warning. In our own neighborhood, people spoke of him with a mixture of pity and disdain. Where he once commanded respect, he now invited avoidance. He had become a man to distance yourself from a liability rather than an asset. For me, the most powerful part of this stage wasn't the spectacle. It was the clarity that followed once the noise settled. I watched my daughter's courage grow each day. She asked difficult questions, faced whispers at school, and still carried herself with grace beyond her years. One afternoon, she looked up from her homework and asked, "Mom, are we safe now?" I could finally answer with certainty that we were. Safety didn't come from silence anymore. It came from the truth being undeniable. But Nathan's refusal to accept defeat pushed him into more dangerous ground. He wasn't only losing control of his image, he was losing the ability to distinguish between fighting for family and fighting for pride. He reached out to mutual acquaintances, tried to gather sympathy, and even sent Sophie a long, rambling message asking her to intervene on his behalf. She didn't bother responding. She forwarded it to me, and I read his words with the detached calm of someone who no longer had anything left to fear from him. His attempts were becoming the desperate flails of a man drowning in the very waters he once thought he commanded. The breaking point came at Delaney's, the upscale restaurant where Nathan had once celebrated every milestone. I knew he had booked a table with 2 colleagues trying to salvage what little business he still had. I also knew Hannah would be there, still clinging to the fantasy that she belonged in his world. I didn't arrive by chance. I arrived by design. Sophie at my side, both of us dressed with quiet confidence. When the maitre d' led us to his table, his face drained of color. Hannah shrank into her chair, her glass trembling in her hand. I stood tall, my voice steady as I reminded him, and everyone listening, that his empire had been built on my inheritance, my sacrifices, my silence. "You can't build a kingdom on stolen bricks." I said the words, carrying farther than I intended. Heads turned, whispers spread, and Nathan's colleagues sat frozen, calculating the damage in real time. That moment was not rage. It was liberation. I picked up my clutch, told the waiter dinner was on me, as it always had been, and walked out. By the time I reached the sidewalk, the scene was already spreading. Within hours, the video was everywhere, replayed, captions shared. Nathan wasn't just a cheater anymore. He was the man who had been publicly stripped of his crown in the very place he once called his throne. Boston is a small city when it comes to reputation. A single sentence in the right room can echo for weeks, and mine had. Nathan had thought humiliation was survivable. What he didn't understand was that humiliation in silence is one thing, but humiliation recorded, shared, and repeated is something else entirely. It was a wound he could not close. Even as I closed my door that evening, Sophie pouring us both glasses of wine in quiet satisfaction, I knew the road ahead would still hold battles. Legal proceedings were slow, deliberate, and unforgiving. But I was no longer afraid of the waiting. I had seen Nathan's mask fall in public, and I knew now that he had no weapon left that could pierce the armor I had built. The next stage would be about more than embarrassment. It would be about permanence, about stripping him not just of reputation, but of power, one document at a time. And as I sat across from my lawyer the following morning, sliding another folder across her desk, I felt the weight of my decision settle into place. This was no longer about surviving his betrayal. It was about finishing what I had started. The storm around him was only gaining strength, and soon it would break entirely. The morning after the Delaney's confrontation, my phone didn't stop buzzing. Friends forwarded clips from strangers' feeds. Texts poured in from acquaintances who hadn't spoken to me in months, and even clients congratulated me in careful, coded words. The video of Nathan's unraveling had spread far beyond that polished dining room, and the sentence I had chosen about kingdoms and stolen bricks was repeated like a verdict. By the time I set the phone face down on the table, I knew it wasn't just gossip anymore. It was a collapse he couldn't control. Nathan's reaction came quickly. He posted a black and white photo of himself sitting in his office, captioned with words about faith and truth. God sees everything, he wrote, as though scripture could replace accountability. The replies were merciless. Screenshots of hotel bills, texts to Hannah, and side-by-side clips from his interview flooded the comments. Each attempt to reclaim the narrative only made him bleed more. Where he sought sympathy, the world gave him evidence, and his words became another piece of proof against him. For a few days, I let the storm burn on its own. I didn't post, didn't comment, didn't answer the calls that came in from reporters hungry for another statement. I sat in Sophie's kitchen with Lily drawing at the table beside me, and I let silence be my strength. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend. Nathan was fighting shadows, and every swing only revealed how little he had left to hold. But humiliation was never enough for him. He wasn't just wounded, he was enraged. 2 days after the restaurant, he escalated. He sent Sophie a message pages long accusing her of turning me against him, accusing me of poisoning Lily, accusing everyone but himself. Sophie read it once, then handed me her phone with a shake of her head. "He's unraveling," she said quietly, and I knew she was right. His words no longer carried the rhythm of control. They carried the panic of a man who had lost it all. The breaking point came one Friday evening when my phone lit up with 6 voicemails in the span of an hour. I listened to them later sitting in my parked car after a client meeting. The first 3 were sharp, full of anger, his voice raised as he demanded answers. The next 2 cracked under the weight of desperation. By the last, his words were raw, pleading, his tone shifting between begging and threatening. "We can fix this, Bella," he said, a name he had never used with tenderness, only with pressure. "Don't do anything stupid. Don't shut the door on me." I replayed the message once, then twice, and by the 3rd time I knew what I was hearing wasn't strength. It was the sound of a man realizing the scaffolding of his life had already been pulled away. That weekend, I prepared for what came next. My lawyer and I reviewed every document again, building the case brick by brick. I wasn't going to let emotion undo what precision had already secured. The divorce wasn't just about separation, it was about permanence. We filed with a stack of evidence so thick, the clerk raised an eyebrow when we set it down. Every photograph, every statement, every financial trail was cataloged. Nathan wanted a battle in the court of opinion, but the real fight was always going to be here under oath, where facts carried more weight than performance. When we walked into the first hearing, Nathan tried to wear confidence like a shield. He arrived in a suit that no longer fit properly, his hair combed with the effort of a man who hadn't slept. Hannah trailed behind him, paler than I remembered her steps, uncertain, as though she already knew the role she had been cast in was ending. His lawyer tried to paint me as unstable, a scorned wife grasping for revenge, but the judge wasn't swayed. When the financial disclosures were presented, the story wrote itself. My inheritance, traced through every account, had built the foundation of his so-called success. Without it, there was nothing. His lawyer sputtered about joint contributions, but the judge's patience wore thin. "Joint contributions do not include misuse of funds for extramarital affairs," my attorney stated calmly, and the chuckle that rippled through the courtroom cut deeper than any insult. Custody followed. Nathan claimed he was a devoted father, but the records didn't agree. School logs, travel receipts, and Lily's own gentle testimony painted a different picture. She spoke softly about nights waiting for him, about seeing him with Hannah at the office. Her words weren't filled with anger, they were filled with truth, and truth was enough. The ruling was swift full custody to me, supervised visitation for him. Nathan's face crumpled as the decision was read, the image of a man who had lost not just his reputation, but his role. It was the first time I almost pitied him, but pity is a luxury I had learned to live without. By spring, the legal dismantling moved into its final stages. The house sold quickly, the proceeds wired into an account shielded by the court. Nathan begged to keep it, calling it his legacy, but the judge reminded him who had paid for it. His car was repossessed in daylight, a tow truck pulling it from the curb while neighbors recorded with their phones. The video made the rounds with captions mocking the fall of a man who once polished his image more than his marriage. At work, his contracts froze, investigations mounted, and partners distanced themselves. His name no longer opened doors, it closed them. The final blow came from Richard the father, who had always tolerated his arrogance. Public shame was the line he could not cross. Richard summoned Nathan to the estate, and though I wasn't there, the message spread quickly through family channels. "You are no son of mine," Richard told him. "The Lancaster name will not carry your stain." Cut off from money, reputation, and even blood, Nathan was left standing in the ruins of a kingdom that had never belonged to him in the first place. For me, life was finally settling into something steady. Lily and I decorated our new apartment, stringing fairy lights across her bedroom wall while she hummed to herself. The air felt lighter there, the kind of air that comes when ghosts don't linger in corners. At night, I tucked her in, listening to her laughter return without the shadow of tension. My clients grew, my work flourished, and for the first time in years, I felt like I was building something not for someone else, but for us. Still, I knew Nathan's story wasn't finished. Men like him rarely accept their own collapse without one last attempt at redemption, even if redemption is just another name for desperation. And when the call finally came from him months later, his voice thinner than I had ever heard, I understood that the final chapter between us was waiting. Part of me dreaded it, and part of me welcomed it. Closure doesn't always arrive quietly. Sometimes it demands to be faced one last time. The call came on a gray October afternoon, months after the court had ended things in my favor. The house was already sold. My new apartment felt settled, and Lily's laughter filled the evenings again. I had almost believed Nathan had disappeared into the background of my life, but his voice on the line told me otherwise. Thin, unsteady, stripped of the arrogance I once knew, he asked me to meet him one last time. At the house, he said, though it was no longer ours. For reasons I didn't understand at first, perhaps closure, perhaps curiosity. I agreed. When I arrived, the brownstone felt hollow, stripped down to echoes and bare walls. Boxes were gone, curtains pulled away, and the silence rang louder than any argument we had ever had inside those rooms. Nathan stood in the living room, shoulders slumped, his once tailored suit hanging loose as if it belonged to someone else. His tie was crooked, his shoes scuffed, and his eyes looked like they hadn't seen sleep in days. He glanced up when I walked in, his expression carrying a mix of relief and desperation. "You came," he whispered, as though my presence was a miracle. "I came to end it," I said quietly. For a moment, neither of us moved. The floor creaked beneath his steps as he came closer, hands open, as if he could surrender what he no longer had. "Isabella, I lost everything," he said, his voice cracking. "My job, the money, my father. Hannah's gone. I'm alone, completely alone." His words hung heavy in the empty room, but I didn't soften. "That's what happens when you burn down your own life," I told him. He flinched, then shook his head. "We had something real. 10 years. Doesn't that mean anything?" My chest tightened for only a heartbeat, but I refused to let him see it. 10 years of lies aren't erased by nostalgia. He ran a trembling hand through his hair, the gesture familiar, but no longer persuasive. "We can start over," he pleaded. "You, me, Lily. I'll go to therapy. I'll fix everything. Just don't shut the door forever." A humorless laugh slipped from me. "You want to fix everything now, after humiliating me, stealing my inheritance, dragging our daughter through your circus? You had 1,000 chances, Nathan. You chose yourself every single time." His face crumpled, tears welling in the eyes that once charmed boardrooms. "I thought I deserved more," he admitted, and there it was, the truth stripped of excuses. He hadn't betrayed me because I failed. He had betrayed me because his ego was endless. "You didn't deserve more," I said, my voice steady. "You deserved exactly what you have now." "Nothing." The words landed sharper than I expected, and he staggered back as though struck. "Please, Isabella," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Don't leave me like this. I can't do this alone." For a second, I saw the boy he used to be. Ambitious, reckless, desperate to prove himself. But that boy had long since become the man standing in front of me, hollowed out by greed. I stepped closer, meeting his eyes one last time. "You are alone because you built walls instead of bridges. You are broken because you broke everyone who loved you. You are drowning because you filled your own pockets with stones." His lips trembled, and he sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "So that's it? You're just going to walk away?" "Yes," I whispered, "because you are the architect of your own destruction." He sobbed, shoulders shaking, but I felt nothing. No pity, no rage, only release. I turned toward the door, the echo of my heels, the only sound in the stripped-down house. At the threshold, I paused, looking back only once. "Goodbye, Nathan. This is the last time you'll see me standing still. From now on, I only move forward." And with that, I left. Outside, the October air pressed cold against my skin, but it felt like freedom. The city stretched ahead, alive and moving, while behind me the brownstone shrank into nothing more than a chapter already closed. Nathan's pleading voice still echoed faintly in my ears, but I didn't carry it with me. Each step down the stone steps felt lighter than the last. For years, I had lived with weight pressing on my chest, waiting for someone else to change, to be better, to come home. But the truth was clear now. Home wasn't a person. It was the life I chose to build. A year later, I would look back on that afternoon as the final severing. By then, I barely recognized the woman in the mirror, not because my appearance had changed, but because the heaviness was gone. Lily and I had carved out a new life together, our apartment overlooking the Charles River, bright with laughter and light. Mornings smelled like pancakes again. Evenings ended with bedtime stories instead of silence. My PR practice had grown, fueled in part by the resilience I had shown through Nathan's collapse. Clients came to me not just for strategy, but because they trusted a woman who had weathered the storm and stood steady. But the greatest change wasn't in my work. It was in Lily. Her laughter came freely now, her questions sharper, her sense of safety restored. One evening, as she spread her homework across the kitchen table, she looked up and said, "Mommy, I'm glad it's just us. You're happier now." Her words struck deeper than any legal ruling or financial win. She had seen the worst of it more than a child should ever see, and yet she carried not despair, but strength. That was the inheritance I wanted her to carry. The knowledge that betrayal doesn't define you, and dignity can be reclaimed. Still, sometimes, whispers about Nathan reached me. That he was living in a one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, working odd jobs, his once tailored suits pawned away. That Hannah had long since left her name absent from any place that mattered. That his father still refused to take his calls. He had become irrelevant, a man mentioned only in passing, a warning, rather than a legacy. I never sought him out, never chased those rumors. His story was no longer mine to hold. As winter approached again, I found myself decorating a tree with Lily's soft music playing in the background, the air scented with cinnamon. Exactly a year had passed since the Christmas morning that changed everything. She handed me a small box wrapped in clumsy paper, grinning wide. Inside was a bracelet she had strung herself, the letters spelling out, "Strong." "Because you are," she said, beaming. I pulled her close, hugging her until she squealed with laughter. In that moment, I knew the journey was over, not because Nathan had lost, but because we had won. The past had finally settled into its place, and the future stretched out in front of us, clear and bright. The final lesson was waiting, but I already knew what it would be. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't what you take away, it's the life you build after. When I think back on everything that happened, what stays with me most is not the shouting or the scandal. It's the silence afterward, the kind that lets you hear your own heartbeat again. Nathan's world crumbled in front of everyone he once worked so hard to impress, and for a long time I thought that was the justice I wanted. But over time, I learned the real justice wasn't his downfall. It was my freedom. Lily and I built something quiet and steady, brick by brick, in the small apartment that became our home. It wasn't the brownstone with polished floors and expensive fixtures, but it was filled with laughter instead of tension. The sound of her humming while she taped fairy lights above her bed felt richer than any applause Nathan ever chased. Every night when I tucked her in, I saw a child who had learned not despair but resilience, and I knew I had made the right choice. Sophie stayed by my side through all of it, her voice steady when mine wavered, her kitchen always open when I needed a place to catch my breath. She reminded me that family is not measured by titles or appearances, but by who stands with you when the storm hits. Even Richard, who once held his pride above everything, chose honesty in the end, refusing to carry Nathan's stain forward. His words may have been harsh, but they drew a line that could never be crossed again. As for Hannah, she vanished from our lives long before the papers were signed. I don't know where she went, and truthfully, I don't care. Her absence is its own answer. Nathan, last I heard, is living quietly on the edges of the city, a man stripped of status and company. He is no longer a threat to me or to Lily, and that is enough. The lesson I carry is not about revenge, though I will not deny the satisfaction of watching truth prevail. It is about dignity, about choosing to protect myself and my daughter when staying silent would have been easier in the moment, but far more costly in the long run. Betrayal did not define us. It revealed us, and it reminded me that strength is not loud. It is steady, patient, and unwilling to break when pushed. On the anniversary of that Christmas morning, Lily handed me a bracelet she had made herself, beads spelling out one word, strong. I wear it often, not as a reminder of what I lost, but of what I reclaimed. Every time I glance down at it, I think of how far we've come and how the life we have now was worth every painful step it took to get here. So, if you take anything from my story, let it be this. You are allowed to walk away from what breaks you. You are allowed to gather the pieces of yourself and build again, even if it's smaller, even if it's quieter. Because sometimes the smallest spaces carry the greatest peace. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you've lived through your own season of betrayal and renewal, Your words might help someone else find their strength too.